So this morning, we are very fortunate to have someone joining from far, far away. This would not be possible without the pandemic. So that is a silver lining of the pandemic. Carly Trachtman, or I should say Dr. Carly Trachtman, is just finishing up, I guess, at the University of California, Berkeley. Carly will soon join the let me get it right, IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute. So Carly will present her study, which was conducted with researchers at Universitas Gajah Mada. This is about whether your neighbors actually know your condition. So community targeting in Purworejo, is it? In Central Java, which is actually right now very much in the news because there is some that is in near Purworejo, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the Wadas case. Yeah, it's the controversy of there is some land conflict issue. Anyway, so the floor is yours, Carly. We usually have about maximum 40 minutes for the presentation, and then we will follow up with Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you all for coming and having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to share some work made with colleagues at Gajah Mada, including Yudhistira Pramana, who's here with us, as well as Gumiwang Sahadewo. So let me dive in. Ooh, there we go.
Recording in progress.
So just to motivate this work a little bit, a common policy goal that various governments and other non-governmental institutions around the world often hold is how to sort of improve people's welfare. And of course, we often care about sort of helping people escape from long-term poverty and, sort of structural forces that send people into poverty. But we often also care about sort of just helping people improve their current welfare, and specifically providing immediate relief due to either idiosyncratic shocks or idiosyncratic effects of more macro shocks. And of course, we can think of the recent example of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many governments sort of tried to rush to immediately get aid to people who suddenly, didn't have food or weren't employed. So a key question with these types of social benefits programs is, how can we actually target the benefits to those who are currently most in need, given that there are often limited resources and we can't sort of afford to give benefits to everybody? Now, of course, this is an issue that can be really challenging, even in developed countries where we often have sort of comprehensive tax bases and employment records. But it can be even more challenging in developing countries where these types of records often don't exist. So because of this, often in developing countries, there are alternative targeting regimes that are used to sort of identify these poorest and neediest households. They generally have sort of a flavor of being based on proxies, and basically using these sort of fairly static proxies to predict somebody's current welfare status. And these proxies tend to be things like asset ownership, as it can be fairly easy to observe, for example, the quality of somebody's housing materials, as well as demographic characteristics, like whether there are a certain number of children in the household. Now, of course, these are useful proxies in predicting welfare. However, you'll notice that they're fairly static, and they may not necessarily respond to these types of transitory shocks that can sort of put a household temporarily underwater. For example, I may not downgrade the quality of my roof based on, a poor harvest, for example. So what might we do instead? There we go. Okay. So another potential targeting regime in these sort of low information type environments might be community-based targeting. And the idea behind this is that instead of policymakers trying to use these proxies to predict current welfare, we instead just ask local communities for help in identifying which households are neediest. And this is commonly used throughout many scenarios in the developing world. Some of the reasons that it's often used is because it tends to be sort of cheaper than these more data-intensive proxy-based methods where you have to be collecting a lot of information, and also potentially gives local communities more agency. But more relevant to sort of the problem that I'm posing here is that we might think that it's helpful at getting some of this more dynamic information and that individuals might sort of be able to observe which of their neighbors are more currently in distress. And I think that this argument is summed up nicely in some of these seminal quotes from the literature. So, for example, this quote from Alderman 2002, which says that local individuals may know about transitory income shocks, such as an illness or a crop failure, that in the absence of perfect insurance or credit markets may bring current consumption below expectation, conditional on the household's endowment. So what is the claim? Essentially, the idea is that local communities might sort of have more of this dynamic information about others' welfare than what policymakers can easily observe. And notably, this is something that we often assume in various sort of contexts in the development literature. And so there are a lot of other paradigms that also rely on communities sort of having this good dynamic information. So despite sort of the intuitiveness, what is the evidence? Well, the evidence that we have to date often relies on correlations between community targeting allocation outcomes. So, for example, who in the community is identified as poorest and to receive benefits, and survey metrics of welfare that we think of as more dynamic. So, for example, something like consumption that we might think goes down when a household is in distress and they cut back on food. We look at that, see that the households that are chosen by the community have low levels of consumption, and therefore sort of conclude that the community has information about somebody's consumption that they're using in targeting, which might sort of be more dynamic. However, the tricky thing here is that the community may not have the same information, even about a fixed attribute, as what one would sort of report about themselves on a survey. And because these welfare metrics that are both sort of containing more static and more dynamic information are often correlated, it's sort of hard to tell what community members actually know and are using. And for an example, a correlation between consumption and these targeting recipients may actually sort of just indicate the idea that people actually have more static information, given that consumption also sort of depends on permanent income as well. So what's sort of the contribution here? Well, here, instead of trying to learn something based on these correlations with survey data, we're instead directly eliciting which information individuals have about their neighbors, sort of by asking them directly about these different various more static and more dynamic welfare metrics. Keep doing this. Okay, so the research questions are as follows. First, we want to know what welfare-related information community members have about others. I keep moving things. Okay, specifically, how dynamic is this information? Is it sort of capturing these shocks that people are facing? How does it compare to similar metrics that we often capture via survey? And do we capture sort of more of this dynamic information than we would under standard alternative targeting regimes and sort of these common methods where we are collecting information about proxies? And then once we have that information, we ask which pieces of this information do community members actually use when they are sort of making these targeting decisions about who should receive social benefits. And we look at this both sort of with people making individual decisions by themselves, as well as during a joint ranking exercise. So just to briefly summarize what we do here, we carry out a household survey, a set of lab in the field type experimental tasks, as well as community meetings with 300 families in 10 communities in the Purworejo Regency of Central Java, as we mentioned earlier. To highlight the experimental task component, which is sort of perhaps the most interesting part, we ask individuals to make various welfare-related rankings of other families under various prompts and incentive schemes. And specifically, these take two key forms. One form is sort of a standard targeting task, where we're asking individuals to identify which of their neighbors are poorest, where those sort of indicated as poorest will then receive additional social benefits. So again, very similar to a standard targeting exercise. And perhaps the more novel part, the second type of exercises we ask them to do are information elicitation exercises. So essentially, we ask individuals to rank the same set of neighbors based on a variety of different welfare proxies, where again, some are more dynamic, like perhaps consumption expenditures and neediness, and others are more fixed, like assets. And importantly, we incentivize participants in the second class of tasks for their accuracy. So we're not, necessarily confounded by other types of incentives people might have in allocating transfers to others. And we can sort of cleanly get at this question of what information that people actually have. So once we have, the results from these experiments, we can try to understand the information the community has by comparing survey-assessed and participant-assessed welfare metrics for all of these different benchmarks. And then to understand the information the community actually uses in targeting, we can then compare these participant-assessed welfare information to the rankings they actually make in the targeting exercises. So to just briefly summarize the findings, there are 3 key findings. First, we find that community members, perhaps contrary to what we might have expected, seem to have very little welfare information of the sort of dynamic variety in terms of being able to capture sort of these short-term shocks that others faced. Instead, community members seem to have more information about these relatively more static metrics like asset ownership. And accordingly, this seems to primarily be the type of information that they use when making targeting decisions. And then finally, when we ask individuals to, instead of just making decisions by themselves, to instead make targeting decisions at a group meeting with others, we find that the outcomes or the targeting outcomes are very similar between sort of the individual and the group decisions. Okay, so just to sort of briefly outline where I'm going to go, I'm going to talk very briefly about a little bit more background in the literature and the contribution. I'll talk a little bit about sort of how we're thinking about measuring welfare in theory and practice, talk through the settings and the procedures of the experiment, go through some results, and then conclude. So there is a large body of literature that many of you may be familiar with that sort of contrasts the outcomes of community-based targeting to some of these more standard proxy-based measures. And one of the more common proxy-based measures that's used is a proxy means test, where essentially we collect data on a bunch of sort of very easily observable assets and then use this to predict consumption, usually by sort of mapping out that relationship in another similar data set. And so there's this large body of literature sort of contrasting the targeting outcomes from these methods to what is chosen by the community. Now, of course, as you might expect, community-based targeting and these more proxy-based methods tend to have fairly different targeting outcomes. And the literature has identified 3 key sources of variation. So first, there might be the influence of community preferences in targeting decisions. So for example, I may, as a community member, have a different objective than a policymaker, and perhaps want to give, benefits to my friends or family, or if I'm a local leader, perhaps, give it to constituents for sort of political reasons. And so, there's some literature on this. The second set of differences is generally sort of a question of differences in welfare criterion. And this is because, as I mentioned, these proxy means test scores are often sort of developed with a formula that looks to predict consumption, which is one specific welfare metric. But of course, when we just ask communities to sort of identify the poorest households, they may be sort of considering other definitions of poverty that are not directly mapped to consumption. And then the third set of differences, which is what we'll be thinking about mostly here, is differences in the information set. So even thinking about sort of the same characteristics, the community may have very different information about an attribute than what we would capture via survey. And notably, when we sort of don't have a good sense of what information community members actually have, it can be very easy to sort of confound these different, these different sets of deviations. So for example, if I see individuals, really giving a lot of benefits to family members, we might think this is because the community has different preferences, when in actuality, it could be that I know that my family members are poor and I don't know that others are poor because I know them less well. And again, differences in welfare criteria can be difficult, just given that, like I said, a lot of these different welfare proxies are correlated. And so it can be sort of hard to tell what information the community actually uses when you don't give a specific benchmark. So the sort of direct evidence about community information, which is where we're contributing to date, is fairly scant. It usually is sort of either relies on just a few key informant interviews with local leaders, only thinks about static welfare metrics rather than these dynamic welfare metrics, which we might also care about, or sort of has these unincentivized exercises that can be fairly difficult to interpret. And so to make the contribution more explicit, what we're going to do here is be able to directly elicit welfare information that many different community members have about others on both these sort of relatively more dynamic and more static metrics, and then compare this information to sort of actual incentivized targeting outcomes, both at the individual and community level. Okay. So I've made some claims about various welfare metrics being able to capture more dynamic and more static welfare information. Let me sort of give you the basis and why I think, certain measures might be better at capturing dynamics. So to sort of think about this, to back up a step, we want to know, how do we observe a household in distress that maybe faced the shock like a bad harvest or, a poor effect of the COVID pandemic? Ideally, it would be nice to see something like income and notice, okay, they had less income for their harvest, for example. But often, like I mentioned in the motivation, this can be very hard to observe. So I'll argue that we can either estimate or observe the following objects instead. We can often see the total value of consumption or consumption expenditures. We can often get at some sort of estimate of the marginal utility of consumption, so something like neediness. And then we can often sort of measure something associated with asset stock. Now, notably, if we think that these local communities have really good functional credit markets and asset markets without sort of liquidity constraints, we might think that a household that faced sort of a temporary shock of a low income would actually just sell off assets and smooth their consumption over time so that they wouldn't have to go with less meals, given that we often think that, there's a preference to keep consumption stable over time. And in that scenario, we would actually think that perhaps a change in assets would be more indicative of a household facing a shock. However, in the scenario that we're thinking about here, these types of sort of complete credit and asset markets likely don't exist. And because of this, households can't sort of smooth their consumption simply by selling off assets. So instead, we would sort of see a decrease in consumption when households have sort of a poor income shock, and accordingly an increase in the marginal utility of consumption. So how do we measure these things in practice? To get consumption, we measure per capita consumption expenditures on food. And this is sort of a commonly used method to measure welfare throughout the developing world. To estimate neediness, I'm using this novel measure of the index of an estimated marginal utility of expenditures from Ligon 2020. Ethan Ligon is my advisor, so I know these methods well. I could talk about this for an hour as well, but essentially what I want you to sort of get from this is that it's a metric that sort of has a nice interpretation as neediness. And the reason that it's sort of different from just looking at per capita consumption expenditures is that it sort of leverages additional information from the composition of a household's consumption basket. So essentially, you can think of, by this method, households that are sort of consuming more income elastic goods like meat and fruit are going to look like more well off than households that are, for example, only consuming staple grains like rice. And notably, this is the first application of this measure to the targeting literature. And then to look at assets, we're going to use sort of a principal component index of various different ownership of various different assets. And if you don't like this method, for robustness, we also look at sort of the total value of land, given that land is an important productive asset in this context. Okay, so let me get into the fun stuff here. So as I mentioned, the setting is 3 villages within the Purworejo Regency of Central Java. We're thinking of the community here as approximately an erte. And so this is sort of what you can think of. Usually they have maybe 50 to 70 households. Certainly, like I said, community targeting has been done all over the world, but notably a lot of the sort of seminal literature in community-based targeting targeting has been carried out in Indonesia. And so this is sort of helpful for interpreting the results. To give you sort of a context of what these households look like, they're fairly poor. So you can think of the median weekly per capita expenditures on food being around, 73,000 rupiah. I think this is something like 16 US dollars. So maybe like 20 something Australian dollars. Don't have that conversion off the top of my head, unfortunately. These are primarily agricultural households growing small rice plots. These communities happen to be very socially homogenous, so they're primarily Muslim, Javanese communities. Many of the household heads have sort of been born where they currently live, like 85%, and people are generally very active in community organizations. And we think that this is sort of a context that it makes sense to look at these questions, given that people may know each other very well and have good information about their neighbors. And local institutions making decisions is certainly something that would make sense in this context. So to talk about the study, a brief timeline, we did a listing in late 2020 where we essentially chose Erites and families from village rosters. Then in March through April of 2021, we did a household visit where households were given a survey about their own household, and then also did a series of experimental tasks where they ranked their neighbors. In April of 2021, we then did a community meeting in each of these 10 communities where either the participant in the sort of survey and exercises or someone from their household was invited. And then in June through July of 2021, we also did a follow-up survey in 3 of these communities where we asked people to sort of redo everything they did more or less during this household visit. Notably, we might be sort of thinking, how did COVID-19 affect all of this? Unfortunately, at this time, people in this area weren't really necessarily socially distancing for what I understand from the field, and sort of were sharing information as they normally might. That being said, I would say that perhaps the pandemic wasn't quite as bad in this area as it was in some other places in the world over this period. Okay, so let me explain the experimental tasks so you have an idea of how to interpret the results. So after the respondent completed the survey about their own household, they were shown 20 note cards with the names of other sort of family heads in their community in a random order. And for each, they were asked how well they know that household. And notably, they could give various different responses. It wasn't just kind of like, I know them or I don't. Basically, it ranged from like, I'm a close family member or friend of this person to I've never heard of them. And then because 20 households is a lot of households, we then subset to 10 households to do the rest of the experimental exercises. And specifically, we oversample and have approximately 8 of those households be out of the category that were indicated as sort of well-known by that household. Because the idea was to really understand what information people do have, not sort of the information that they don't have about people they don't know. We do, however, include some sort of less known households as well, just given that we didn't want to systematically exclude certain households. So once we had these 10 households, we asked them to do a variety of tasks. The first task that they were asked to do was the targeting task, where they were asked to rank families from poorest to richest. And the incentive here was that some number of those ranked as poorest would receive an additional 5,000 rupiah from the experiment. So indeed, you could think of this as sort of targeting a very small social benefit, which again, like I said, these are fairly poor households. So while 5,000 rupiah may not be that much, it's not insignificant. After they did this targeting task where they were sort of allocating transfers to poor households, then the participants did a variety of information elicitation tasks that were presented in a random order. So specifically, they were asked about these 3 different welfare benchmarks that I mentioned earlier. So for consumption, we asked participants to rank families from spending the least on food per person in a week to spending the most. For neediness, we asked them to rank from most needy of additional money to least. And then for assets, we asked to rank from having least asset wealth to most. And notably here, the incentive, instead of like the targeting task, there was actually no money given to sort of the households ranked poor. And instead, we paid the participant themselves more money based on whether sort of their ranking well matched what we collected in our survey. And specifically, we looked at how correlated their responses were to sort of what we calculated in our survey with the metrics that I mentioned earlier of per capita consumption, the estimated MUE metric, and the asset index. And of course, we didn't exactly tell participants exactly how we were calculating these different metrics to compare it to. However, they should at least understand the type of information we collected, given that we also collected it from that person themselves about their family during the survey. So then the community meeting was very similar to sort of the individual targeting task, except that it was done as a group. So first, there was a framing exercise where individuals were asked to sort of jointly list characteristics associated with being poor and being rich to sort of fix ideas among the community. And then communities were asked to collaboratively rank all 30 of the families in that community from poorest to richest, where again, some number ranked as poorest would get a bit of a larger transfer. Okay. In terms of the results, which I will show you very shortly, I promise, I want to give a little bit of context just because these are perhaps a funky way of looking at results that economists are not used to. But essentially what I'm going to be showing you are Spearman rank correlation coefficients. And what you can think of this as is a non-parametric measure of rank correlation, explaining sort of how monotonic the relationship between two variables is. And so really what it's saying is how much do the rankings suggested by the participant and suggested by the survey, how much do they agree? And specifically, if these two rankings rank the 10 families exactly the same, that would be a correlation of 1. If they rank them in the exact opposite order, so the survey says, this person's poorest to this person is richest, and, I do the opposite, that would give a correlation of -1. Now, any sort of other types of things in between this, we get, somewhere between -1 and 1, where 0 would be no correlation at all. Notably, sort of small mistakes here aren't going to have a big impact. So for example, if, I think that person 1 and person 2 that are poorest and second poorest look really, similar, I can't quite tell, and I accidentally rank the second person poorest as poorest, that takes us from, a perfect 1 to 0.99. So, not a big penalty. Where we start to get sort of these bigger penalties is when people make larger mistakes. So for example, if I switch a distance 6 pair, which means, let's say I rank the person who's second poorest as actually 8th poorest and move the 8th poorest person to second, that's going to start getting us sort of bigger deductions from 1 to 0.56. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is for each participant and each metric, I can calculate, how well that participant's ranking based on that metric, like consumption, for example, how correlated their consumption ranking is with the one suggested by the survey. I can also do that for assets as well, so I can look at how well their asset measure is correlated with survey measured assets. And then, because I have these correlations for each participant, we can look at the average correlation over participants and see whether sort of, on average, systematically, participants are giving more similar information about certain welfare metrics to the survey than others. Okay. So now for the good part, the results. So the results sort of have these 3 points. First, looking at the information the community has, the information they use, and then sort of what happens at the community meeting. So first, we might, ask, how close are these survey metrics to what the participants tell us? And the results are here. So how do you interpret this? If you just sort of focus on this top panel, these numbers are the average rank correlation over participants for the metrics shown. So this is for expenditures, this is for neediness, and then this is for assets as measured by the index and as measured by land. And so what we can see is that for expenditures, the average participants ranking correlated with what was suggested by the survey only at 0.16. So again, remember, perfect correlation would be 1. You'll notice that as we sort of start to look at these sort of more static measures based sort of related to assets, that the correlations are much higher. So again, these are not 1, certainly 0.445 is different than 1, but it's also much higher than sort of the correlation for the expenditures. And specifically, these little superscripts denote that something is statistically significantly greater than the column indicated. So that the correlation for assets between participants in the survey is statistically significantly higher than their correlations both for the neediness metric and the expenditures metric. So we might also worry for households that people know really well, maybe we would think that they would do a little bit better. So here I subset and just use households that are well known by the participant, and we see that the results don't change. So while the correlation is quite low between the survey and participant for all of the metrics, it's especially low for sort of the more dynamic ones, which is perhaps contrary to what we would have thought. Additionally, we actually, during the survey, asked participants to report directly about whether 3 randomly chosen households recently faced a shock, as well as whether 3 randomly chosen households were currently receiving benefits associated with COVID-19, sort of getting at the sense of, whether people sort of have this very current information. Now here we allowed people to just sort of not provide a guess if they didn't have one. And indeed, in about half of cases, people refused to even guess whether the randomly indicated chosen family recently experienced a shock or is currently receiving COVID support benefits. And notably, this is not due to them sort of being unfamiliar with the household. This is only sort of a very small portion of refusals to answer. Among those people who did answer, the information that they have is not particularly high. So notably, families who self-reported that they faced a shock are identified correctly by other participants only 13% of the time. And notably, this is no better than random, given that participants identify sort of all families as having received a shock, whether they actually had or had not, 13% of the time. So they're literally nowhere likely to identify these shock recipients, I guess, as having had a shock. On the other hand, for COVID support, there is a little bit of an informational gain. So those who indeed say, yes, I'm receiving COVID benefits are identified correctly by their neighbors in 68% of cases. And this is significantly higher than sort of the 48% of all families that participants identify as receiving COVID benefits. Okay. So perhaps the question that's most relevant from a policy perspective is, if we compare what the community tells us to sort of a very simple proxy-based method, is the community actually sort of identifying more of this dynamic information than what can be captured by a proxy means test? So I'm using very simple proxy means test here. So one is from the Poverty Probability Index, the other is from the Simple Poverty Scorecard. And so these are sort of the 2 columns indicating those proxy means. These 4 columns are looking at all the 4 different participant rankings based on either their targeting decisions or the different welfare benchmarks, and looking at how closely each of these things is correlated with survey measured expenditure rankings, neediness rankings, and asset rankings. And what you'll see is that these sort of very simple proxy means tests using less than 10 pieces of information to predict welfare are significantly outperforming literally every single participant ranking in most cases, with these P's denoting being significantly greater than columns 3 through 6. And so it's not sort of an issue of us asking participants the wrong question. As I said earlier, of maybe, they're not targeting on consumption. Even when we ask people to sort of directly target on consumption, they're not sort of doing better than a proxy means test is at predicting it. Okay, so that's just summarizing these points. Let me keep moving. So now that we understand the information people have, which again seems to be not quite the same as the survey, especially for the more dynamic metrics, what information do they actually use in targeting? So here, what I'm looking at is the correlation between the information participants provide on these 3 different welfare metrics and the information that they, and the ranking that they make in the targeting task to try to understand which of these pieces of information is the most similar. What you'll see is that out of these 3 metrics, that the asset ranking is significantly more highly correlated with the targeting rankings than either of the other 2 benchmarks. However, all three of these rankings between participants tend to be correlated, and so some of this high correlation is sort of mechanical. Notably, participants also sort of overwhelmingly justify their decisions when they're asked to sort of explain different pairwise rankings, citing differences in land ownership. And additionally, we do some other tests, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit in the Q&A, and basically find that there doesn't seem to be a large role, at least in the experiment, of people sort of exerting preferences over perhaps family members, for example, in targeting, and sort of giving people that they don't actually think are for the transfers. We don't really see evidence of this. So I showed you that the assets are sort of most highly correlated with the targeting ranking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't using some other dynamic information. So we then ask, after we control for the assets, does this dynamic information explain any of the sort of leftover residual variation in targeting outcomes? And so what these results are a regression analysis of the individual's targeting ranking on some of these different metrics. So when we just regress the targeting ranking on the expenditure, neediness, and asset rankings made by the participants, we see that all have some significant explanatory power. However, if we first regress the targeting ranking on assets and then regress that residual on the sort of two remaining more dynamic metrics, while there is still some explanatory power, you'll notice it's quite low and that the R squared here is around 0.03. So this is just summarizing that point. Finally, when we compare the targeting decisions people make by themselves at their household visit, how does that compare to what they decide in the community at a meeting? We might sort of think that communities at a meeting would sort of make more accurate rankings if they're able to sort of pick the best information among various different people. So we might sort of think that there might be different gains here. What we find is that on average, individuals' targeting decisions are actually quite highly correlated with what is decided at the community meeting. And indeed, the average ranking correlation is between the individual and their community is about 0.66, with the distribution sort of highly concentrated in very high correlations. Additionally, these results are robust to sort of controlling for meeting attendance. This is likely because we get pretty high attendance, so 90% of families end up sending a member to the meeting, and the meeting attendees generally seem to look very similar to the person who responded to the survey when they were taking it at home. Additionally, I'm able to sort of replicate these results in the last point about the community meeting in a larger data set that likely many of you are familiar with from the Alatas et al. 2012 study on targeting. Their data, I'm sort of, it's a little bit different, but I'm able to replicate those results almost exactly. So finally, like I said, we might think we would get more accuracy at a community meeting. And so we might think that the community rankings would be more correlated with the sort of survey assessed rankings than individuals would be on average. We don't find evidence that this is true. So this top row is looking at the average correlation between individual targeting rankings and various sort of survey benchmarks. And then the bottom row is looking at the correlation between the community meeting rankings and the various survey benchmarks. And you'll see that these things are not statistically different from each other, even though perhaps the meeting ones are slightly higher. So let me just wrap up really briefly in my 0 minutes left. So just to recap the findings here, what we see is that the information community members have about their neighbors tends to be quite different than survey collected information, even if we ask about the sort of exact same welfare benchmark. And this is especially true for the more dynamic welfare metrics that we thought perhaps communities would actually have better information about. Instead, like sort of these standard methods, community members seem to also be using these relatively static welfare proxies like asset ownership to try to predict who's currently the poorest and the neediest. And additionally, we see that information aggregation at the community level doesn't really change this. So what does this mean for policy? Well, first, I think the perhaps most striking conclusion is that community-based targeting does not seem to have an advantage over standard methods in sort of identifying these households that are in very acute distress from, perhaps recently facing a shock. And it's not sort of an easy fix of just asking communities a different question. It's not that we were asking them for the wrong information. Even if we ask them for the right information, they can't, give it to us necessarily. That being said, I don't think this is like sort of a full damnation of community-based targeting. I think it's still potentially quite useful in capturing some of these like longer-term poverty attributes like assets. As I mentioned earlier, it can give communities agency in local decision-making and can sort of be much more expensive than proxy means tests. Additionally, when thinking about sort of why we get these differences between community-based targeting outcomes and proxy-based targeting outcomes, we don't find evidence, at least here, that it's because of something like elite capture or nepotism. It doesn't seem like communities have some sort of dramatically different definition of welfare than a policymaker might. Mostly, both are sort of using assets to predict welfare. And mainly, it seems to be sort of this difference in information. And to the extent that surveys may not sort of perfectly capture welfare information either, it's sort of unclear, whether this sort of community-based targeting is actually performing that poorly, especially sort of on asset ownership. Notably, I think in future research, it will be important to sort of think about the local information environment and whether these results will sort of carry in other settings throughout the developing world, where sort of differences in social structure or the like may matter a lot. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to hear your questions, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Carly. That was really a very clear presentation. And, it's, I think someone like you can teach very well from the way that you explained your research. So I hope that you might also consider still teaching. So we have a question in the Q&A box, but Mas Darendra said that he would like to ask directly. So I'm going to unmute Mas Darendra. And then I see also raised hand by, okay, hang on. Well, I raise hand, cannot do simultaneously identify and unmute Mas Gifari. So Mas Darendra first and then Mas Gifari. Silakan, you are unmuted.
Terima kasih Bu Lydia. Thanks very much, Carly. Really nice presentation. From what I experienced regarding this targeting, my name is Rendra from Bognas. From what I've seen in the field, I found a situation where often local communities, they provide useful or reliable, so to speak, information on welfare status of their citizens, especially in the rural context. Probably different story in the urban settings, but sometimes this useful information we solicit from the community does not necessarily lead to the proper targeting of beneficiaries, usually due to the cases of bounded rationality, elite capture, resentment, and so on and so forth, which sometimes revolves around social characteristics, social capital, culture, and so on. I know this is probably beyond the scope of research, but it will be appreciated if I can hear more from you. Probably you've already done some literature review works, scoping study, and so on. And Bu Lydia, can I have one more
Sure,
question?
yes.
Many thanks. I would like to also hear if about your experiment. Probably you already mentioned in your slide, but I apologize if I missed one or two slides. I would like to see the detail in the experiment or the context. Some community, local community targeting, they usually modify or innovate. Sometimes they display the candidate of beneficiaries in a public spaces, in a board, huge large board so that everyone can see or check. And they often sometimes open what we call it grievances desk or hotline and so on and so forth. Is that in your research setting? I would like to know if this is already in your research setting, this kind of pop-up innovation and whatnot. Thank you. Thanks for
Great.
the
Yeah. Thank you so much. Those are both very, very good and very relevant questions. So to look at the first point about sort of these types of other influences that can sort of hamper targeting, and that, you know, people are sort of thinking about social capital or other types of incentives to, you know, give transfers to people that may not be the poorest. I think that this is definitely a phenomenon that we see a lot in the field. And I was curious to try to understand, you know, whether we might see this in this context too, and actually how much it might sort of affect the results. So there are actually a few other experimental tasks that we had people do that I, you know, didn't really fully mention for time, but like I said, I'm very happy to talk about now. So one of the things we asked people to do was just to sort of rank people from who they would most like to get additional money to who they would least like to get additional money with sort of no welfare criteria. And then we also asked them to sort of do a ranking that they thought would be most similar to how one of their neighbors would do it. And that one was sort of incentivized for accuracy, in that we sort of looked at how other people ranked, you know, a certain pair of households and whether this person ranked it the same way. And what we find is that both of these rankings are very highly correlated with the targeting ranking that they make sort of when allocating transfers. So how do I interpret this? Well, first we might be worried that, oh wow, so the preference ranking of who I most want to get a transfer looks very similar to the targeting ranking. However, like I said, these targeting rankings were very highly correlated with, as well, the incentivized sort of welfare elicitation rankings. So it seems like, in this case, more so than anything else, that people weren't sort of exerting some other preference. It seemed like sort of the preferences that they were, you know, giving us in this round were really quite similar. Or, you know, it was kind of like who was poorest was the people that they were trying to give transfers to. That being said, is that always the case? Probably not. I mean, it's certainly people act differently when they know they're being watched under an experiment. I do some other stuff where I try to look at whether people sort of systematically rate their close friends or family members as sort of poorer than they actually are. And I don't see evidence of that either. But yeah, I think that, you know, it's certainly something that we need to continue to think about. On the second point of the community observability, I think this is a good point as well. I didn't show it super well, but, you know, during the community meetings, it was sort of this group ranking. And so everybody was participating, was also, you know, being ranked. And there was, you know, lively discussion around this and observability and chances to sort of go back and change decisions. We didn't have sort of like a formal grievance process after that. I mean, I know there certainly have been other studies that have done that and have shown, you know, this certainly increases community satisfaction. I think this was a little bit outside of the scope of what we were doing here, but I think that in general, these types of corrective mechanisms can help, especially if we do see some of these things like, you know, elite capture or, you know, other sort of familiar relationships playing a role. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to Mas Kifari, I would like to also say hi to people attending. I just went through the participants list. Previously, Mas Darendra, he is at the Central Planning Agency here in Jakarta. And I also see among participants, Susan Olivia. Hi, Susan, joining from New Zealand. And others from the think tanks in Jakarta, Smeru, Jepal, and others. So feel free to pose a question. Otherwise, I would have to come up with a question. This is the role of the chair. And also, I invite everyone following on YouTube if you would like to make comments or pose a question, feel free to write it in the comment box. So, Mas Kifari, hang on, I have unmuted. If you can unmute from your end.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so hi Carly. So thank you for the paper. I think it's very good. I've been waiting for the paper for months. It's really interesting. So I've read the paper and I think there is one section that kind of intriguing for me, like section 4.23, the community meeting task. I think on the last paragraph, on the last part of the paragraph, you state that the discussion at these meetings, and you say that already, was generally quite lively. So can you have something to prove your claim here? Because I don't see anything to that support this claim. And also I'm interested in the dynamic of the discussion of the group. I think it's very clever that you do like after discussion and then you do some simple majority to get the anonymity conclusion. I think it's very clever, but I just want to know like how is the dynamic of the group discussion? Because if we know like there should be like there might be one or some group of people that has like a really big voice or something in doing the categorization, and so everyone will also be induced to follow their opinion or something like that. And I think it's like the error impossibility theorem or something like this. So can you tell me like the dynamic of like this discussion, because the dynamic discussion will also driving the result of the community ranking. Thank you.
Okay. Before Carly answer, Mas Kifari, you are joining from from where?
So I'm from University of Chicago. Yeah.
And you're right now in Chicago?
Yep.
Okay, that's great. So it's very happy for you to join us, especially as you have know the paper quite well. Can I put in one small question, because I think this is related to Mas Gifari's question. When participants fill out the survey at their home, who does it generally? Do you have information about that? Because just thinking back about households, I would be very surprised if my father knows about the neighbors, but my mother certainly does. So if you can fill in about the who in participating in the experiment. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, these are all great questions as well. And congratulations on still being awake in Chicago. So to say about the meetings, I think this is a great point. So we actually did sort of attempt to collect information about what was actually going on in the meeting and who was speaking, and sort of who had the most influence and the like. In practice, I think it was fairly hard for the enumerators to sort of capture this in real time. And because of that, I didn't sort of do a ton of analysis on that data just because it was a little bit hard to work with, but I think it's something that I could work more with. I'm just mostly sort of basing the sort of current claims about the liveliness of discussion by the fact that these meetings did tend to last a few hours. There tends to be like a few votes based on disagreements and just sort of the anecdotal claims of the enumerators. But I agree with you that it would be great if I could support that more. And certainly I had hoped to, and maybe that's also a question for future work and really thinking about how to carefully code up these things. Regarding your question, Lydia, about sort of who is filling out the survey. So essentially, I do have data on this. We asked it to either be sort of the family head or their spouse, but we were allowing people to make that choice for themselves. It tends to be in, I think, the majority of cases, a woman, so it tends to be often sort of the spouse. I think most of the cases. At the community meeting, the sort of one little difference we do see is that while it's still a majority of women attending the meeting, it is actually slightly less than sort of the percentage of women that are filling out the survey. So I agree that certainly we didn't exactly tell people, what they were going to be doing later, except for, like something about community decision making. And so it could have been the case that maybe we were asking the wrong person. But hopefully, by looking at sort of a household head or a spouse, we could sort of simulate who would be a decision maker in these types of contexts.
Okay, thank you. Since I don't see any more questions, maybe I post another one. I have a long list of questions just to make sure that You all participants fail me and leave me to it. Oh, Givari, Mas Givari, okay, my lifesaver. Go ahead, Mas Givari. I think you should still be unmuted.
Okay, so this is just out of curiosity and just a quick question. Do we have information like dissatisfaction for the result after the community meeting? So I think like because it is a simple majority, so some of the people like they didn't get the result that they want. So do we have information about that? Like how much the percentage of dissatisfaction and what is the average majority percentage of the result? So I think I don't know. I just want to know like the dynamic of the discussion, the interaction between people, and then maybe between the local elite or something like that. So do we have any information about that? Thank you.
Yeah. So again, that's a good question. We have a few indicators of just sort of like a numerator comments on like whether they saw like a lot of disagreement and things like that. It doesn't sort of seem, at least from their qualitative comments, that there were people that were very upset. But we didn't sort of do, a careful data collection where we sort of, talk to people separately and try to, really get at their feelings. What I will say is it does seem like perhaps people did learn something at this community meeting. And while sort of the, like I said, people, what they did sort of beforehand by themselves tended to be highly correlated. As I also mentioned, we also resurveyed some people about three-ish months later and asked them to redo some of these information elicitation tasks by themselves. And what we see is that people are updating their rankings based on what they learned at the meeting, even though it was sort of quite a long time ago at this point. And it's not necessarily that the rankings become any more accurate. In fact, they're like pretty much the same amount of accuracy on average between the two rounds. But it does seem that, people are perhaps, learning different information that maybe they didn't have and sort of incorporating that. So I do think that there could be a lot more to be done here about trying to understand the community satisfaction. And I think there are some other pieces of work that have, looked at this and found, depending on the setting, sort of different results about whether, communities felt satisfied with the targeting process. Or perhaps more satisfied than in cases where they weren't given a say. But yeah, we unfortunately don't have great data to answer that question here. And I think it's an important concern.
Do the participants know the objective of the study? Was it put in context as an experiment or as a way to provide social assistance? Because if that's the case, they might have some strategic, there could be some strategic behavior.
Yeah, so what we told them at the beginning of the experiment was that we are not part of the government. We are part of, UGM and UC Berkeley. And we're just basically trying to do research on the ways communities make decisions. So we tried to be very clear about that from the beginning. That being said, can I rule out that, that somebody might have thought we were, from the government? Probably not. But that being said, like, at least in the tests we do, we don't see like any evidence of like a lot of strategic manipulation or things like that. But of course, that there could be some things that are sort of harder to catch that may have been going on as well.
Okay, that's good. So we still have plenty of time if people want to ask questions, or even though if it's a clarification question. Susan has mentioned earlier that she has clarification question, but that she would ask you directly later on. But Susan or others, feel free to pose your comments or your questions. We have some time, and we had 43, I think, or 44 people in the room. I see that Ibu Sri Rahmat has a question. Ibu Sri, let me check if you would like to I have unmuted you, Ibu. If you would like to ask directly, feel free, but otherwise I can read it out.
Thank you, Mbak Lydia.
Iya.
Thank you and Carly for the presentation. It's really great. And I'm really curious whether many findings of your research could be adapted to influence the design of social security for the national level coverage, or only specific coverage, for example, district, because you adapt taking some qualitative data. The qualitative mostly applicable for small coverage. Maybe you have some idea for policy suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Sri. Ibu Sri is from the Agency of Statistics here in Jakarta. Before you answer that, I also have a short question here in the Q&A box from Ari Zulkarnain, asking if do you have any information if research participants came from families that have persons with disability?
Thanks. Yes, these are both good questions. I will answer the second one briefly first because I think the answer is probably shorter. So we did ask that question about whether there were disabled people in the household. I think in practice, the percentage was quite low. So I'm not able to potentially do some sort of subgroup analysis because there just wouldn't be enough data. But I think that that's a good question in general. In terms of the policy relevance and sort of where this applies, I mean, I think that context, like I said, can be probably very important with this sort of work that is so heavily reliant on what is sort of the community's information sharing structure. So certainly I would be a little bit hesitant to just sort of apply our findings to other settings more broadly. I have some work in a more urban setting in a very different context in Liberia that has sort of broadly similar conclusions that people don't have a ton of information about their neighbors either, but like I said, very, very different. In terms of, how can we use these findings? I think that the sort of question here is maybe a negative result in that it's an indication that we have to keep working harder to try to figure out how we really catch these families that are in distress. Because it doesn't necessarily seem like, these proxy-based methods that are often used are doing a great job at capturing this. And, perhaps in the past we thought, okay, well, then maybe we can just fill in these gaps by asking the community members. It doesn't necessarily seem like that's the case. That being said, in a lot of countries, because it is so expensive, the social databases tend to, not be updated perhaps as frequently as we would like them to be. And because of this, I mean, it does seem like perhaps there could even be some gain in, just sort of asking community members to try to fill in some of the gaps, because certainly they might be able to sort of detect large changes in welfare. And I do see a little bit of evidence of this in the paper, just sort of looking at between rounds. It does seem that participants sort of identify large changes in neediness, though perhaps not smaller ones. So I think there is some scope for communities, in this type of work. And as I said, I think that using community-based targeting also can potentially make sense for programs that are looking for sort of these long-term sort of structural factors. Certainly, if I just want to figure out, which households have productive assets like land, perhaps it's more efficient to ask local community members than to try to do a big survey where somebody has to, go around everywhere. So I think these are sort of the important things that I would take away is that, these dynamics are really hard to capture. I'm not sure any of our current methods are doing it that well. As more people have cell phones in their hands, I am optimistic that perhaps, there'll be more, verification of these types of things in real time. Maybe I can show that I had a bad harvest because I can, take a picture of my fields and what it looked like before and after. And, this is potentially the way of the future. I don't know. I guess we'll see as things move forward. But that, like I said, I think that the community can provide information in some scenarios, but as you mentioned, it might be hard to extrapolate to other cases. And so it's important to sort of keep doing similar work in other places as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think not only from the data generation part, but also it would be interesting to see in the context of urban community, for example, because you had mentioned about cell phone. Now with WhatsApp group, everybody seems to know about everybody else. So that is that kind of information. But whether that is more deeply related about not only short-term shocks, about people sick, and also nowadays it seems that if a baby screams, the neighbor, start discussing is something wrong, but whether it's a more longer-term portrait of the households. Let's see, there is, okay, I don't see any more questions. I put a link to a blog that Carly did, very good one, on the World Bank website. So feel free to check that out. And also, I think if you are interested more in the paper, it is on Carly's personal web page, which of course you can Google and it will come up. So, there is some additional information from Pak Yudhistira. Maybe Pak Yudhistira, if you would like to explain this a little bit.
All
yeah,
right.
Feel free, Pak.
Yeah, thanks. So, just had a double meeting. So, to add the things on the leader questions, yes, we
seems that the connection, there's a connection problem. But while we wait for Pak Yudhistira to come back, he has written in the chat box about the technicalities of the experiment. So you can see in the chat box what was said when the team went to the village to conduct the experiment. So it's not part of the government, and also as Kali mentioned, it is pure research. Okay, sorry that Pak Yudhistira is gone. Maybe we wait for 1 or 2 minutes. If anybody would like to make comments, or if you are doing similar research in field experiments, this is something that it's not quite new, but still relatively rare, I think, being engaged in the real world. Of course, because one, it's expensive, and two, there sometimes in Indonesia there are bureaucracies, so you have to have a lot of permits. You are not with a big name; it gets a bit hard. But I also see here Ibu Leni Darmawan, who has worked extensively in village programs. Oh, I think Ibu Leni just left. So okay. Because there are no more questions, and very good presentation by Carly, I interpret that because everything is very clear, at least to me, who is not in this area of research. It's really very clear. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and especially for those joining from other parts of the world. Thank you for coming, and thank you also for Carly, and best wishes for your work with IFPRI. We look forward to engaging with you again in the future, hopefully. And for everyone, before I close, I will put up a schedule for the rest of February. We have 2 more seminars. 2 of them are next week. One is from Yayasan Inspirasi about how we can alleviate learning loss, and another one is from University of Gadjah Mada academic on green financing. Okay, thank you. And before I close, I will put up the slides. Thank you again. See you in the next events. Thanks, Carly. See you soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Good night, Carly.
thank you, Lydia. Bye, Carly.
Oh, sorry, Pa.